Jim and I are going to share the more detailed route description together. I'll take it up until that last really incredible part where they were alpine climbing. 4 of our team climbed 2,500 feet in a push, no camps, to the summit of K2. This brilliant alpine climbing brought American success on K2 after many, many years. Plagued by blizzards of snow and blizzards of emotions, we were one day from pulling the plug and going home. As Jim mentioned, he led an expedition to K2 in 1975 to climb the Northeast Ridge. They too were beset by blizzards of snow and blizzards of emotion, and they had to pull the plug and come home. But you have a good feeling for Jim already. Ever the visionary, he started planning our 78 expedition as soon as he got home. Jim is used to success. First American to climb Everest, first president of REI, the peace climb. You could bet he was going back to K2. Tragedy struck early in our expedition planning. Leif Patterson, member of the 75 expedition, was killed along with his son and his son's good friend. I didn't get to know Leif. I knew a bit about reading, but last week I had dinner with my good buddy Fred Dunham, who was on the 75 trip, and asked him about Leif. And he said Leif was a powerful climber, perfect companion. And those of you who know Fred Dunham, there's no higher praise. The year before we left, we lost 2 more members of our trip team in a climbing accident. Al Givler and Dusan Yagerski were killed both climbing in Alaska. Both were very close friends of mine and climbing companions. We joined Jim's team together, and I ended up reflecting long and hard whether I would stay on the expedition. Ultimately, I recommitted to go with Jim. We had 360 porters and cascading numbers, as Jim described, each carrying 55 pounds of gear, plus anything of their own that they wanted to take, like an extra sweater or a cooking pot or something. And we began the 125-mile hike to our camp on K2. We first traveled through the area where there are lots of Balti villages built on these outwashes of floods that give them some dirt that they can farm. Baltis are really interesting and lovable people. They carry their tradition on in songs and in dances and chants. And they're just incredibly beautifully to watch and very, very varied. Some of these are very rhythmic, others are twisting and like sword dancing, reflecting their mix of cultures. This is the end of the Baltoro Glacier. It's all covered with rock and rubble at the end for miles and miles. And this is K2, first view poking up behind lots of peaks. We still had about half our trip and about 60 miles going around. But the character really changes at this point. You get these beautiful, incredible unbelievable mountain views. This is Paju right near the end. This is Walla Lee, a porter I spent several days walking part-time with in front of the Mustang Tower. Masherbrum is a striking peak. It's only a couple hundred meters short of 8,000 meters and was first climbed by Americans, Willie Unsold and George Bell, on an expedition that was led by Nick Clinch. Another peak right near K2. This is the lowest of the 8,000 meter peaks, hidden peak. It's one of the Gashbrum peaks, but it's very difficult to see unless you're high in the mountains. It was the only 8,000 meter peak that was climbed first by Americans. And it was climbed by Pete Schoening and Andy Kaufman. This is a picture of Pete in that expedition, 1958, looking up at K2, where he had been in 1953. He's carrying that axe that Phil Peters described. He didn't retire it after holding 6 fallen climbers in a boot axe belay. He kept using it. He had it reshafted from ash to hickory, though, which will mean something to some of us, but not much to most of you. The Abruzzi Ridge, where they were climbing in 39, 38, 53, and where it was first climbed by the Italians in 54, goes up through here, and then pretty much along the skyline here. It was right in here where essentially the whole team fell in a tangle of ropes, all held by Pete's axe. And they would have had a ride down there, all because of one belay. 38 team had gotten a little bit higher. 39 team almost made the summit. 53 after that accident and weather called it quits. And today's presentation on our expedition will pick up this route up in this area here and go to the summit. This is base camp, the traditional base camp, where you agree with the porters, they'll take your stuff. Salim sat here the whole expedition, providing logistical communications amongst the team members and their walkie-talkies, and back with Pakistan as a whole. And his cook, who we affectionately called Good Morning, because he would always greet us with good morning and offer us tea. The route we climbed, or had come to climb, had been attempted in 1976 by an extremely strong Polish expedition. And they reached a point, about up in here at their high camp. So base camps on the other side of the mountain here, we had the porters carry stuff up in here, and we called it our advanced base camp. And then Camp 1, safe from most avalanches of rock or snow and ice, became effectively our base camp. So this is our Camp 1. Our Camp 2 is right up in here. Camp 3 perched at the start of this incredible traverse. Camp 4 about at the end of the sharp part of the ridge, and then on up. This is later in the season in Camp 1. It started pitched all on snow, but as snow melted, there was the rubble of the edge of the glacier under us. We were very optimistic because the time from establishing Camp 1 to Camp 2 to Camp 3 was only a week. We had good weather, and by establishing, we had the route in and fixed ropes in. We didn't have the tents and everything up, but they were real solid. So we were thinking we might climb the mountain and leave a month early. So this is looking down on Camp 2. Heading up to Camp 3. We established again Camp 3 after about 3 weeks. And then the first of the recurring patterns of storms hit. For essentially the rest of the expedition, we'd have 5 to 7 days of snow, storms blowing, a couple, 3 days of clear weather, first deadly avalanche day, and second, maybe sort of dangerous avalanche day. Third, well, not 100% chance at least. One of the things that Fred Dunham told me based on 75 trip is when you have a big storm, get off the mountain. That way you don't have all that food and fuel that you've preciously carried up there consumed, and you're sleeping badly and come back down. The disadvantage of that is you have to come down in a storm. The first storm, I was the only one amongst probably 9 or 10 of us stormbound in Camp 2 that said, let's go down. And so I felt strong enough that I went down by myself. At least going down ropes, if you trigger an avalanche, it's probably mostly below you. I triggered 3 avalanches and went across a crevassed glacier and was welcomed back by Diana and was really glad to be back. So that it brings up the dilemma that you have with these recurring snow patterns. Here's a day after a beautiful early morning. Everything is just, whoops. Everything is nice and smooth. 2 or 3 feet of new powder snow on top of icy crust. And so the advantage of having somebody in a high camp is they can break out the trail and the rope going down, but going up is a different matter. In any case, it's lots and lots of work. This is looking down on Camp 3 on starting the climb up to that knife-edged ridge. To see the kinds of questions you have on avalanche stuff. He's got a rope, but is that snow going to slide? And half the time it would. You can see climbers strung along here on the ropes. Even though that doesn't build up extremely deep snowbanks, it still will break away and slide. Another view of Camp 4. John Roskelley's famous thing. You also notice the yellow snow where the males had cut out the mosquito netting in the side of the tent and would just hang out and piss. That's going into China, so it was okay. About this time, Jim Whittaker announced a summit team. John Roskelley, Rick Ridgeway, Lou Reichardt, and Jim Wickwire. We still were about halfway up the mountain with a lot of snow patterns. And the feeling was by announcing the team, then we'd be able to focus on having the strongest people high up. But it immediately broke the bond within the team. Already there were lots of personnel problems, as Jim was alluding to, hanging out, and especially when you have the uncertainty of snow things. And it caused a real notch up in the frustrations within the team. Then we had a massive storm. And everybody, except for Rick Ridgeway and John Roskelley, who stayed up in Camp 4, were all down into Camp 1. And it was almost open revolt. And inside this cook tent is a 12 by 12 tent, which is sort of a cheap camping tent, but proved to be one of the strongest tents on K2. You can see it has a bit of a list from its history. But all of us were stacked in there, and Jim Whittaker really made a major move in defusing this situation by rescinding his selection of 4 summit members and going ahead to address other things and say, well, we'll go as one team again, and we'll let the mountain decide who climbs. Rob Shaler played a critical role, not only as a physician treating us, physician treating the Balties, but a mental counselor. He was on 75 and really moderated and handled a very good meeting, and we left that with strong feelings of goodwill. We made a plan of what to take and leave at every camp and take to higher camps. And it decided once the weather turned good, we would go as a team back up to Camp 3 and camp, and then go from there. The weather broke and we started. I was surprised when some of our teams started much earlier than we'd planned. We'd set a time. It turned out they were going to Camp 4 instead of Camp 3 as planned. So as the last part of us started getting into Camp 3, they were on their way to Camp 4. The goodwill and feeling we were one team in Camp 1 just evaporated. Tempers exploded. Within days, everyone was off the mountain, except the original summit team, Terry and Cherie Beck, and Jim and Diane. I'd like to turn it over to Jim, and he has the remarkable story of what happened next.
Yeah. Good. Yeah.
Early in the morning of September 4th, 6 of us were in Camp 5, 3,000 feet below the summit. John Roskelley, Rick Ridgeway, that's Lou Reichardt. I went past Ridgeway. Lou Reichardt, Terry Beck, and Cherie Beck, and then me. After days of indecision, we all agreed to Terry's bold plan for 2 simultaneous attempts on the summit. It was our last chance. John and Rick would try the direct finish that had defeated a strong Polish team 2 years before. To improve our chances, Lou and I would take a new traverse across to the Abruzzi Ridge route and follow it to the summit. In a selfless act, Terry and Cherie were up there to carry loads for Lou and me across. On her way to Camp 5, a couple of days before, Cherie had become highly hypothermic. With a rest day to recover, she could only go a short distance beyond camp before hitting the wall and returning back to camp. We said our goodbyes in awe of her grit. On our first attempt to get across, and this is actually some of Terry's 8mm footage, and it's not functioning properly on here, but it was trying to show you the deep snow that we encountered. But we didn't make it all the way across due to those snow conditions, and returned to Camp 5 for the night and just to regroup. Now, meanwhile, John and Rick had spent 10 hours that same day climbing from Camp 5 up to their Camp 6 in the deep snow, and they took another couple hours to find a cache of food, fuel, and oxygen that Lou and I had left there the week before. This is their Camp 6, and that was Lou on the carry. The next morning, Lou left camp ahead of Terry and me. John and Rick were already on their way up to their camp, or they were there from the previous day. And our job was, Lou was going to go retrace the steps across the traverse to see if conditions had improved. Terry and I waited at the route junction to, we weren't sure of the outcome, but when Lou came back, we'd seen some avalanches come down, and Lou was optimistic about what he'd seen. He'd actually gone further. So we headed across and made it to the shoulder of the summit pyramid, not quite to the Abruzzi route at this point, but we'd been able to cross the Bergschrund, and we're in position to go higher. We put the camp in this edge of the crevasse right below the big ice cliff, and we were worried about avalanches, but that was all we had. That night, melting snow at one end of the tent for the fluids we desperately needed, I tipped over a full pot of water. I was down at one end of the tent, not once, but twice. My down parka and half bag were useless chunks of ice, and I was left with a lightweight 60-40 wind parka, a down vest, and, most important, at Cherie's urging, her down pants, which she had loaned me at Camp 5. As Lou and I were organizing to leave camp at 4, another thing, I shoved my water bottle down inside my parka to keep it from freezing, and out the bottom it went skittering down the slope. And it didn't really register with me. And I did realize that these small mistakes were starting to build up. Terry had been willing to carry higher, but we misunderstood his intentions. We did thank him for his tremendous support in getting us to this camp, and took leave of him and headed up in the dark. Lou set such a fast pace at the start, I had real trouble keeping up with him. He was probably kind to slow down. And now I want to show you the first of several remarkable images that Rob Shaler down at Camp 1 at 18,500 took with a 500mm lens, and he captures the whole climb. I had no idea he had this until 3 or 4 years ago, and it's just, it allows us to see everything going up, and you as well. Now there's Terry headed down back across the traverse to Camp 5. Lou and I are headed up toward the base of the ice cliff into that narrow gully that is now referred to as the bottleneck. At 26.5, I decided to go on oxygen. Maybe it'd help me keep up with Lou a little bit better, and continued up. But I was surprised to discover that my bottle was only 2/3 full, another little error, and I knew I'd have to conserve it 1 or 2 liters a minute. As I led into the bottleneck, a little bit higher where you see it there, Lou also went on oxygen, and he climbed past me to these steep snow-covered rock slabs. And this is really the crux of the whole route, this little section here. A lot of exposure to your left. He quickly realized that his oxygen was not working at all. And while he tinkered with it, I took the lead started taking the lead to go around the corner of the ice cliff. And I wanted to show you a shot that the Japanese took the year before to give you a little sense of the angle of the slope, which doesn't show up in those long photos. I climbed around the corner of the ice cliff, and then I went directly up the 45-degree slope there. And to make progress, I had to bash my elbow into the crust to create a hole, and then put your leg down and crunch down the snow, and it was just a very slow process of moving up. Now, I looked back down, and I saw Lou take off his backpack, dump it on the slope, and start climbing up to where I waited. He told me that he hadn't been able to fix his oxygen equipment and would try to summit without it. He was concerned about becoming hypothermic and asked me to assess his mental condition as we went higher. At one point, we looked down and we could see John and Rick traversing directly beneath us toward Camp 6. They had given up on the Polish finish because of the obvious avalanche hazard, and the good news of that was that if Lou and I were turned back, John and Rick were in position to complete the climb to the summit, and we'd have that success that Jim talked about. It didn't matter who got there, somebody had to. We kept searching for better snow, and I traversed left, and as I was going across, I turned upslope again, not realizing that Lou below me is continuing further left to get to this ridge he saw on the skyline. And along the way, and it was something we had agreed to, if we got too far apart in searching for good snow, to go unroped. So he untied the rope. I didn't quite see him do it, but I soon realized. And as I went higher, I could see he was not sinking into the snow, just in his ankles. So I decided then to head across and join his tracks. And once I got over there, he was probably 150 feet ahead of me or more. And as hard as I tried, I could not close the gap between us. And here I was the one on oxygen. Not only that, he was breaking trail. There was still some pretty good snow to go through. And that's a tribute to Lou Reichardt's great physical strength and his unbending willpower. Now, climbing higher, a little bit further up the slope there, he finally showed he was human after all, as he began to slow down, and the only reason was that the oxygen was starting to give me a bit of an edge so I could gradually close that gap. And finally, he stopped 400 feet below the summit, and he was ready to, it's your turn to lead, he said. So I get the last 400 feet, and I was in a zone-like state that I think it made the climbing almost effortless. It was like a magnet. And I went through a little mental game. With each step, I tried to fix my mind on one dear person. First, my wife, Mary Lou, each of our 5 kids, my mom and dad, other family members, and then other friends, and then repeating it. Now, I could see here's going up that slope. This is before we did the switch of leads. And which happened right there. You can see us standing together. And then above that is where I'm in this zone-like state. And the summit's probably 300 feet higher at this point. I could see the slopes converging and knew we were getting close. Diane Roberts was at Camp 3 with Jim, where they were monitoring the climb. They were the next highest on the mountain, or not the next highest, because the Becks were between us. But she got these nice telephotos that showed us near the summit, and then the last one where I was able to step off the slope and then into the sunshine. And the sun is on the front of us. My back is in shadow because the sun's still in the sky on the other side. So this was right almost at the summit, within just a few feet, if not on the summit itself. And as Lou joined me and we stood there together, I said something like, we've come this far together, let's go the rest of the way, to the top. And so we just walked side by side, kind of arm in arm, and there was a hug along the way somewhere, and then we were on top. And the immediate thing was that Lou was quite cold because he had left his down parka down there in his pack. Of course, he didn't have the oxygen, and so he wanted to get out of there and get down the mountain. And I tried his patience with far too many photos, and this is the best one I got. And he finally shot one of me, the last one in the roll, and then as he left the summit, right here, he stepped off the summit. Rob again caught this. I told him, I'll see you down at Camp 6. So it was an agreement. There was no anything other than we knew what we were doing. He probably thought I was nuts to stay, but I wanted to take some more photos, basically. And we had a few other things to do with our microfilm of all our contributors to the expedition that had been sponsored by the American Alpine Club, by the way. So here at the American Alpine Club. Now, in changing film, my camera lens iced up, no more photos. All the lower peaks were out there on the horizon, and K2's shadow to the east. But you get a real sense of history here because we knew about our predecessors who had preceded us, and we climbed on their backs. And so I couldn't help but think about all of our predecessors, but most of all, the 1953 team. And they were at the same time, not quite while we're on the summit, earlier that summer, they're celebrating their 25th anniversary in the Wind Rivers. And I just wanted to show you them. That's Dee Molinar on the left, working to the right, Bob Bates, and we have Gail Bates is here with us, by the way. She's right down here. Gail, can you help? Okay, it's amazing. I won't tell you how old she is. Right. It's in 3 digits, we'll put it that way. But one other thing I wanted to mention was that as Lou and I were coming up, we also could look down and see what had happened there in '53 when Pete pulled off the most renowned belay in mountaineering history when he saved his 5 falling teammates, and here's Pete, and the mortally sick Art Gilkey. And they saved them all at that point from certain death. And we know what happened to Art. He didn't make it down. By the time I left the summit, the sun was down and it was already twilight. And rather than risk a fall in the dark, I decided the best thing was to find a place to bivouac for the night. I was kind of mentally ready for it, and we were really late getting up there. It was 5, 10, 15 in the afternoon. It's September, the sun's going down earlier. So I came down that slope, and I found the only place that made any sense, and that was a small saddle at about 27,600 feet, a little lower than has been stated previously in some of the books. And just beyond that climber, descending climber, and this was a photo taken by Carlos Bueller several years later, but just beyond that little bump where the climber is was a nice spot that was sort of level, but it sloped off to the left, which becomes important. But what I did, I leveled out a small platform, crawled inside my ripstop nylon bivouac sack to spend a very long night. Now, I had a stove, but the pot was in Lou's pack, so that didn't do me any good. But I did hover over that stove for a while inside the bivouac sack, trying to stay warm, and soon it ran out, as did my oxygen. At some point during where all this was going on up there in that circle, at some point during the night, I started to realize that I was sliding on a kind of a slow motion basis off the platform. I dug my heels in and stopped, and I kind of, back in I don't know what it was, and it happened 3 or 4 more times, and I was starting to think this is really going to be dangerous. I looked out and was kind of shocked to see that that slope was a lot steeper, so I shoved the sack up onto the platform. It had the oxygen bottle in my pack, and of course the crampons were on the slope, so I was doing this without any crampons on. But I got back up and got back in and did the smart thing, take my ice axe and ice hammer, which I had with me, and I rammed them through a side of the sack, and I was good. I was anchored. Now, mainly, I just concentrated on getting through the night. I knew from earlier bivouacs on Mount Rainier and Denali that morning will come. And looking back, I think the key factor in my surviving that night up there was that Lou and I had made the summit. I mean, you get a little binge of euphoria going and optimism, and it can keep you from worrying about your situation. I think that's what happened. Now, in the morning, Rob caught the first sun on the upper mountain. It was still windy up there, but nothing like what it had been through the night. And I think this was the moment of greatest danger because hypoxia had dulled my mind, and I was just about to just sit there and not do anything. And finally, by concentrating on my wife, Mary Lou, and our 5 kids back in far-off Seattle, I was able to snap out of it and head down the mountain. Now, coming down, I was walking like the Tin Man of Oz as I went. And John and Rick are now, they've traversed across the course and are coming up on their own summit attempt, not knowing what they're going to find with respect to me. But we were converging, and I was getting close to them and eventually joined them. But just before that, John yells across to me, Wickwire, when we get back home, I want to enroll you in my ice climbing school this winter. You could use a few lessons. Now, when I got right to them, I said, I told them that I could make it down on my own and for them to go for the summit because I felt pretty confident I could get down. But when I passed close by John, he patted me on the head, and it sparked an emotion in me at a pretty deep level, just that human touch. So I down climbed the bottleneck and walked the rest of the way to camp. Now, John, true to form, never put on his oxygen mask. He wasn't about to use oxygen up there. Rick was trying to get his mask to fit his face. He had it upside down, he had it sideways, and John is starting, he's out there, and then he's out there a little further, and Rick is realizing that if I don't take off after him, he's going to be gone, and I'm down here, and so that's what he did. He dumped his bottle, and he took off after him. And I should point out, they didn't even bring a rope up here. They were going to do it without ropes. So this climb was essentially done ropeless after the point of Lou and I when we dropped our rope. Now, they made the summit. They remarkably did it without bottled oxygen. Lou had done it that way the previous day. And I should mention that Messner and Hobler had just climbed Everest without oxygen 4 months before. So it was a kind of a big summer for the beginning of the trend against using oxygen on any of these high mountains. Now, they made the summit, as I said, but on the way there, I felt pretty clear-headed, but John was hearing the Doobie Brothers singing, and Rick was seeing palm trees growing out of the snow. So that might have been an interesting experience, but so I'm running out of time here, so I want to speed up. When I got down to camp, there's another shot from the summit looking west. And then down at Camp 6, this is Diane again caught me walking into camp. And so I asked Lou, well, tell me about what your descent was like. And he said, well, I went down and I was in the dark, and I walked past Camp 6, not realizing, and it was only when Rick and John shined their flashlights that he realized his mistake and went back up. Now they said to him when he walked in, "Where's Wickwire?" He said, "Well, he's up there. I last saw him on the summit. I think he's bivouacking, and he's going to be okay." You know, I like that confidence. So they come back, they go up, and this is them on the way down. John is down almost to camp, and it looks like 2 because it's such a slow moment, it's dark, and Rick's coming on behind. And that night, after their return from the summit, we flirted with disaster. The fumes from changing a canister in one stove while the other was burning caused a sudden explosion. And looking out, Lou and I were astonished to see their tent on fire, and then this ball of fire rolling down the mountain. That was Rick's sleeping bag. And we couldn't see what the damage had been in the dark, but we were in our tent, and we realized that there were these 2 guys standing out near the front entrance, and they seemed to want to come inside. This was an omnipotent. It's a little 2-person tent. So in they came, and it was an incredibly claustrophobic night. Rick was having some troubles breathing, so he had to get his face out the entrance. John was on one side, I was on the other, and John at one point wanted to go to the other side of the tent because he was cold and he just was uncomfortable. So that was an incredible gyration of human bodies to make that happen. The next morning, but I had no complaints. It was warm. I was warm. We walked like zombies, leaving the camp, and then started the traverse across to gives you some impression of the immense size of K2 and how puny we humans are compared with that piece of granite and snow and ice. Now, I want to cover 2 things quickly. Terry and Cherie, it's been mentioned that trails got broken up and down. Terry and Cherie broke the trail down from Camp 5 to Camp 4, which helped us get down there. Jim and Diane were at Camp 3, so Jim breaks trail across that ridge you saw, that incredibly difficult ridge. And I think Terry would tell you that he and Cherie were not sure they were going to be able to cross that ridge without Jim coming there to do it. And so I just want to, and I make that, I want to emphasize that because I think what they did, but what Jim as the leader did was it was an example of his leadership because he was up there high on the mountain to safeguard our retreat. He was not down at the mountain. A lot of leaders are down below, guiding everybody from down there. Now, we had an extra day there because a storm came in, and of course, Cherie and Terry were doing a magnificent job of plying us with food and liquids, which we badly needed. And the last storm came in, and we ended up not getting down to Camp 1 until September 11th. We got down there, and Rob, who was one of our 3 physicians, can you imagine having an expedition with 3 doctors? That's pretty good. They were all highly competent, great doctors. But Rob examined Rick for checking out his ailments, and then I sat down and had a cup of tea, having no appreciation whatsoever of the peril I was in. Because it didn't take long when Rob came to me to put a stethoscope on my chest and back and announced that I had pneumonia and pleurisy. Okay, so then he puts me on IV fluids for the night in the tent. Diane and Diana Jagursky were wonderful nurses that night. And the next morning, I felt like walking down from Camp 1 to get back down to the base camp. It's about 5 miles, I think. And I had a lot of assistants, Jim and Diane and Bill and Robbie, they were all around me. I felt like I was just being escorted down the mountain, and it's a tremendous psychological boost to have that kind of support, because doing it alone would have, I don't think it would have worked out the same. But we finally get down to here's coming into base camp. And that night, my condition worsened, and they decided to put me in a litter, a makeshift litter, and take me further than that. So the next morning, we go down to Concordia, which is, I think, another 9 miles, from 16.5 down to 15. And it was really, they did a great job, but it's this jostling because it's so rocky. And so I decided, well, I want to walk again. And so from Concordia, again with an escort, Jim's behind me, and one of our hap porters, Onar Beg, is out in front. And we get down finally, and now we're down. I rest about every 200 yards along the way, and then we get to the last, well, this is just to give you a shot of Rob. And I put him here because I just want to convey how hard he worked to keep me from succumbing to my ailments. And so 40 years later, I still have a lot of gratitude to Rob for that, and he's sadly gone. But I also want to thank all my teammates, because they, first of all, had to be patient because they're really going slow to accommodate me. And the kindness and just the overall support just was absolutely wonderful. And it reflects that team spirit that Jim talked about at the very beginning, and that Bill emphasized in his talk. And the last night on the glacier, I was in the tent, and the Baldies were singing, these chanting and singing, and it was wonderful music. And Salim the next morning said that, let's go back to that one. Salim said that they were praying for my recovery, and I really appreciated that. And now Jim and I are standing there, and I was about to thank them and told them that how much I appreciated that, and that I knew that maybe a helicopter was coming, so I wasn't going to get to go back out through their valleys, and it would just get whisked away. So in the morning, I thanked them, and now I was 6 days from home, and K2 remains.